We're going to get started. I want to thank you all for coming to this panel session. Just a real quick reminder, when this one is over, there will be another session starting right away in here, so please keep your seats, don't run away. I'm sure it'll be a lot of fun, you won't want to miss it. So again, I want to thank you for joining us. My name is Rachel Robinson. I am the Director of Business Development for Acorn Product Development, and I've got an awesome group of panelists here with me that are going to talk to you about MedTech 3.0 and kind of some trends in the industry and where things are going. So just really quickly, a little bit about Acorn Product Development. We are a design and development team focused on hardcore mechanical engineering, founded in 1993. Our founder, Ken Haven, was working with Steve Jobs at Next Computer and realized that all of the products that were coming in to be tested had a lot of fatal flaws, and they were mainly mechanical focused. So he decided, when Next turned into a software computer company, to take it to the next level and start his own firm. We are headquartered in Silicon Valley with offices here in Cambridge, as well as a design team in China and Atlanta. So if you have any questions, we have a booth outside. Love to talk to you a little bit more about what we do and who our clients are. But other than that, I will let our team kind of start introducing themselves. So Art, if we want to start with you, introduce yourself and kind of say what you're working on.
Okay. Good afternoon, welcome. My name is Art Combs. I'm a physician by training and spent 20 years in academic medicine. I used to run an intensive care unit, which is a very device-oriented specialty. I've spent the subsequent 20 years developing new medical technologies, mostly device. And right now I'm working with a company in Lexington called MC10, and we make wearable computers, and I'll talk more about that as the opportunity arises. Welcome.
I am Frank McGillen. I'm Chief Commercial Officer with Neurometrics. We have a wearable technology that's used for treating chronic pain. My background leading up to Neurometrics was building primarily consumer healthcare brands, but also B2B healthcare brands, both in the over-the-counter space, medical device, as well as digital health.
My name is Jim Biggins. I'm the president, founder, and CEO of a company called Access Vascular, a relatively small company in Bedford, Massachusetts, so local. We've developed a novel material that is used for preventing thrombus accumulation, so obviously a very broad clinical issue. We're primarily focused on commercializing our first product, which is a PICC line, and we've submitted our 510K about a week ago and continue to develop our suite of products and enter the venous access space. So happy to be here and on this panel.
So I hope you don't mind me sitting with you guys. I don't like standing, like I'm not part of the conversation. And I want to go ahead and throw this out there. If you have questions at any point, I have a list, but they may not be what you want to talk about. So feel free to raise your hand and jump in and interrupt us as we go. So first, I kind of want to throw a question out to the three of you, because we heard a lot in earlier sessions today about killing things quickly and failing fast. You're all doing really interesting and different things in the space, and I'm kind of curious, was there a moment, and can you think of the first one, where you thought, oh crap, this isn't going to work?
Yeah, that's an easy one. So when we first launched this wearable technology for chronic pain, we had reimbursement, and we were categorized under TENS, Transcutaneous Electrical Nerve Stimulation. Reimbursement went from roughly $600 per patient to like $65 pretty much overnight. So, we had built this whole business plan and model around a traditional prescription medical device model, and that business basically didn't make any sense anymore. So we knew we had a really differentiated technology. We knew we could make a huge difference in the 100 million Americans who are suffering from chronic pain. So we doubled down and decided to go direct to consumer, get OTC labeling, and really take the product direct and remove that barrier of access, which was prescription.
Well, I had an experience which I'm sure other people in the room have had. I was offered an officer, CEO position at a medical device company in December 2007, and made the mistake of taking it, of course, because in 2008, 9, and 10, raising money was almost impossible. During that period of time, a person who was a local, had grown up here and was born and raised in the same town as our company was based, offered to help me. And between his efforts and my own efforts and the fact that we were in the diabetes space where there's a tremendous amount of passion, we were able to raise funds throughout those years. When we came out the other end of the tunnel, it was time for commercialization and to raise a substantial round. We had raised all of the funds heretofore through angels and qualified investors. And we were basically told that our cap table was untenable, that no VC would invest in a company that had 60 individual investors. And then when it came time even to make the funding documents, I was told that if you say that you paid a finder's fee, you might as well call in a nuclear strike on your own position. It was at that time that I realized that trying to raise institutional capital with a complex cap table and a very changed environment at the SEC after the Bernie Madoff scandal, the question of how fast can I get out of here did enter my mind.
All right, well, so I think for me, it depends when you ask me that question. We started the company with a wooden table and a stir plate. And so, at that point, it was all on faith that we thought we could solve this problem with our technology. And so at that point, we had a lot of people telling us, or I guess telling me that, you're crazy for trying to start a company in this space and, nobody's going to fund you. And so at that point, it looks like we have something, let's go try to raise money. Do we want to raise money? And started talking to professional investors and large VCs, and sure enough, that's the message we got, and lots of sleepless nights wondering how we're going to get funded and how we're going to pay salaries. So in the very beginning, I think funding was a primary concern, and always asking myself, nobody's funding medical devices at all. And so could we get the funding? And if we took our first step, can you take the second and third step? And so in those early days, certainly concerned on the funding. And then you get through your technology development, or you continue through intellectual property, which is always a nightmare. Everyone finds something, right? You're going to find something that someone's done in the past, and that was certainly a time when we said, can we get intellectual property that protects us and that has value, even though we're creating something novel? That was a concern then. And now it's shifted again. We're recently closed another round of funding. We've submitted our 510K, and now we're focused on hearing back from the FDA, trying to anticipate potential questions and looking at other areas that we can proliferate the technology. So I would say in different phases we had different concerns.
Not to spend too much time on funding journeys, because that's a whole other panel. But I am curious, Jim, your experience with Angel MD. So can you talk a little bit about that? That's not a route I think that a lot of groups know about taking, and
Sure.
I'd be interested just to see what your perspective was on that.
Yeah, so I was really skeptical when we started dealing with them. Anytime I looked at crowdfunding, most of my investors that had already invested in the company, and certainly other entrepreneurs that I spoke to, said, crowdfunding is not going to work for medical device. And so I went in talking to Angel MD, with a critical eye. However, once we started the process and realized the value that they bring, not only from the financial perspective, but also just their connections and their knowledge, I would say they did a phenomenal job in terms of due diligence. It was by far the longest process we went through. However, I think at the end, we really improved our message and also understood the story a little bit better, because they were looking to try to dig in and really figure out what the opportunity was. So at the end of the day, they came through with a substantial check in a very short time period. So on average, it took me, I'd say 3 to 6 months to get an investor from from zero to check, and they provided a check in 2 months. So
Interesting. I'm curious, has anyone in the audience gone through crowdfunding for medical devices? Just curious if there's anybody who's done it. Think you might be it. That's really exciting. So good, that's actually really interesting. So Frank and Art, I'm curious, why wearables? So there's a lot of interesting technologies, there's a lot of things that can be done. I'm curious as to what led you both to that direction.
So for us, we have a 20-year journey. So, we're new to the consumer space, but Neurometrics was founded 20 years ago, coming out of MIT, Harvard joint program. And we have deep expertise in neurodiagnostics, a test for things ranging from peripheral nerve disease to carpal tunnel syndrome. And we're doing a lot of work in diabetes and saw that there was this tremendous opportunity around chronic pain. I mentioned 100 million Americans are suffering from chronic pain, more than diabetes, heart disease, and cancer combined. $640 billion spent annually, 16,000 opioid deaths, 200 million prescriptions for opioids in the US last year. So, but despite all the spending, despite the tragedy around opioids, despite all these prescriptions being written, over half of patients said they're not getting the kind of relief they need. It was causing depression, causing sleep loss, et cetera. And we believe that there was an opportunity to take what was basically an existing technology called transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation that had tremendous promise, but was really limited by form factor. So if you look at a traditional TENS device, it's basically looks like a science experiment. Cables, wires. Typical consumer has no idea how to dose. They have no really way to use it on an ongoing basis. And the trick to getting effective relief from chronic pain using transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation is you need to stimulate at the right frequency and the right intensity, and you need to stimulate intensively over time. Now, if you think about wearing a harness and a large device, not so convenient for continuous dosing. Whereas we looked at a wearable, and this is our device, that could be worn on the calf. We could make it so that you could dose over time. We also looked at from an automation standpoint and the intelligence and the fact that you can use a smartphone to calibrate it and things, that you can get over the dosing issue and make sure that you're taking advantage of digital tools to basically get that right dosage. So we're able basically to crack a problem for an old technology by applying the principles of wearables, which is the intelligence, consumer friendliness, wearability, and all that into a new device.
Interesting. Before I let Art jump in, I did want to ask you, so just kind of along those lines, chronic pain is something that's so subjective. And how did you kind of deal with that? I mean, was there a credibility issue that you felt like when entering the market, people were going to be very skeptical that something they're so used to opioids, they're so used to implants, they're used to the way things are. Did you really pause to think about how hard that might be?
We definitely put a lot of effort in terms of dealing with the credibility. And I think, to your point, we're all grow up thinking you take a pill and, it'll treat whatever ails you. And we don't give much thought to how it's working. But to tell someone you put this thing on your leg and it's going to treat your sciatica or your back pain or something as misunderstood as fibromyalgia was definitely a leap of faith. And for us, a lot of it really got down to, how do we make the science simple enough on a direct-to-consumer model? Yeah. How do we leverage with partner organizations, U.S. Pain Foundation, National Fibromyalgia Association, American Academy of Podiatric Medicine, but how do we partner with affiliate groups? What we found is there was a hunger out there, but as you said, people have also been burnt. Mm-hmm. copper bracelets,
Yep.
hemp oil.
Yep.
So, people ask, well, who's your competition? I'm like, well, on the level, it's no one, and on the other hand, it's everyone from the guy selling hemp oil on Amazon or eBay to Medtronic. So it makes it a little challenging from a competition standpoint.
And I mean, I would imagine, as someone who is on the internet, consumers can be rabid. When they are thrilled, and when they are very upset, it's extreme.
It is, and social media for us is really important. And we have a large Facebook community. We tap into a lot of the blogger community in chronic pain. And frankly, part of our challenge is how do you moderate expectation? Because people have been burnt. And what we've heard from consumers, from patients, is that you don't need to like make it go away. In fact, if my pain's a 10 every day, if you can get me to a 4, then I can play with my grandkids. I can go shopping. I can do yard work, things that I couldn't do. And really, it's all about managing and getting on with your life. And if you can do that without drugs and not feeling loopy and not feeling lethargic, that's a huge win.
Interesting. Okay, Art, your turn. Why wearables?
Why wearables? So how many hours do you guys have? For me, as a physician, I think that wearables is becoming an answer to a problem that's existed right in front of us and didn't realize it. The doctor-patient relationship, which in many ways is considered sacred, is also painfully intermittent, brief, imprecise, subjective, a whole bunch of things that you'd like to not think they are, but they are. You go see your physician, you have maybe 5 minutes. They spend 4.5 of that trying to figure out the Epic system. And they may examine you. They'll take your blood pressure once. They'll take your pulse once. They'll listen to your heart once. And they'll see you in 6 months. That would be bad enough, except for the fact that the patient's not him or herself in the doctor's office. So there's such a thing as white coat hypertension, but there are all kinds of things that make that situation completely artificial, not the least of which is medical technology, because they have all this stuff in the office, and when you go there, they use all this stuff, but when you go home, you don't have any of it. So there's no way to know how you're doing in your environment, in your habitat, when you're not nervous, when you're not pressed for time, when you're not being rushed along, when you're not worried about what it's going to cost, when you're just you. The question is, how is your health? So that's one question. Second question is, well, what is available technologically? There are lots of clever devices out there, but they're not the kind of device, very much to your point, that you want to wear 24 hours a day or every day or over a long period of time. I'll come back to that. Number 3, and then I'll pass it on. What you can learn when you have continuous data, what you can learn when you have data over a longer period of time is much, much, much better for 2 reasons. The first one is it gives you a sense of trend, it gives you a sense of what might be events, but more than that, it opens up the opportunity to use modern tools. You're not limited by a physician's astuteness or perceptiveness or powers of observation at any given moment in time. You can use so-called big data. You can look at machine learning algorithms. You can find things in that collection of data that could never, no matter who your doctor is, have been captured in an intermittent office visit. So why wearables? So that you can gather continuous data on the patient in a comfortable way over a long period of time while they're in their own habitat This is how to assess how healthy is my patient, how are they responding to my medication, how is their disease progressing.
I think I get it. So we'll stop. Any questions from the audience before I jump in on Jim and materials? Because this could be a while. No? Good? Okay, great. Oh, yes.
Just on the heels of that, what's your concern with data integrity? So relying on that data that is accurate enough for you to prescribe or treat?
Well, obviously, it's an excellent question. The sensors have to be accurate, and they are compared, of course, to both gold standards and all of the regulatory compliance requirements for testing them, whether it's the analog front end or it's an accelerometer or a gyroscope, whatever it is. So in terms of testing, does this sensor work? There are standards, and those can be met. A different question is data integrity in the broader sense. Our company has created an end-to-end solution. This is not just gathering data and then anybody anywhere can do whatever they want with it. It goes to a proprietary docking station, from which it goes to a proprietary cloud, in which it is analyzed by proprietary algorithms and is in a repository, all of which is hyper secure, HIPAA compliant, et cetera.
Just one thing to add to that is, we're finding that there's also with wearables an opportunity to actually supplement things that were tracked very imprecisely over time. So if you look at pain, the typical way to measure pain is a 10-point scale in a diary that's done in a very, uncontrolled fashion. Whereas, because we have a wearable technology, we can collect time, longitudinally, which actually lets you look at data points that are actually more important than a diary score. Activity levels, sleep quality, gait, and different very, very objective measurements. So I think getting more data, maybe there are some opportunity or some issues potentially with quality of all data points, but more data points helps you get a better picture of the actual outcome.
You can answer my next question too for me, thanks.
The only reason why I ask is because that's where the consumer wearables are failing, right? They're not providing accurate data, plus or minus 20% on a Fitbit right now. And it's interesting that Fitbit is now part of the pilot for the pre-cert program. So.
Let me make one brief comment on that. I'm going to take what I think is the high road. Our company had an opportunity to make this decision. Do we want to be a medical device, or do we want to be Fitbit? Okay? I mean, you know what the difference is. One, you can tell you 8 months in advance, we're going to launch, and you can pre-sell and you can market and you can do whatever you want. And the other, you're not allowed to do any of that until and unless you're cleared to market. But that's not the point. This is where, as a physician, my sensibilities come. At your wrist, you can measure pulse rate. On the chest, you can measure heart rate. Now, if you're a 25-year-old out for a jog, there's probably not a lot of difference between those two things. But if you're an old person with heart failure and you're having ventricular prematures or you're in atrial fibrillation, there is a marked disparity between genuine heart rate as electrical events and pulses perceived at the wrist. So the question is, if I were going to give you a device to decide how your heart medication was working, or if I was doing a clinical trial to clear the next heart medication for chronic atrial fibrillation, which device would you want? We made the decision that we're going to be a medical device and create around these things, actigraphy, vital signs like heart rate, sleep and sleep quality metrics, et cetera. We are going to put around that a real medical device with real clinical endpoints. Thank you.
He'll be here all day if anyone wants to question him. Try the veal. Okay, so Jim, I know when we talked on the phone a little bit, we were talking about some specific challenges you faced in this particular type of innovation. A lot of people are doing wearables and really cool, upcoming, brand new, state-of-the-art technology You took a different route in wanting to see what was going on inside hospitals before making any kind of decision. I'm really curious as to what made you go with a new material.
Yeah, so our decision to start the company was really based on what I'll call primary market research. So I spent 18 months shadowing physicians in really almost every aspect of medicine in and around the Boston area, looking for those unmet needs. And then the technology was really driven from those unmet needs. And based on my experience developing products for Medtronic and Boston Scientific and seeing the lack of innovation in the material space, and then flash forward to my experience shadowing physicians, it was palatable in terms of the frustration from clinicians, from nurses to interventional radiologists, their frustration with the performance of existing devices, and then certainly with the changes to reimbursement. I felt like it was almost a perfect storm of the ability to innovate within specifically venous access. Now, I think we've created a technology that has uses outside of that space, but really the genesis of the material development was from experiences in the marketplace.
So if you found this everywhere, why aren't people doing more of this? What do you think the real challenges and holdups are? What's kind of roadblocking things?
I think there's probably a laundry list. The biggest problems that I've seen in the space, lack of funding. Nobody wants to fund a medical device or a straight medical device, and that's been going on for 15 years. Lack of innovation at large strategics with their focus on existing market share, right? If you own 75% of a market and you don't see a lot of market share erosion, your incentives to invest in that space and be creative in that space don't exist. And so now I think the opportunity is developing where there's obviously a lot of acquisition activity, companies looking, medical device companies specifically looking for things that are immediately accretive. Those opportunities are drying up, and so they have to look to earlier innovative companies that for the most part don't exist, right? Because nobody's funded, nobody was interested, and I think I see a lot of interest from larger strategics that say, hey, listen, we're kind of getting to the end of our technology in terms of its life cycle. What do we do now? And there's been a lack of innovation there. So I would say yes, it's been fascinating to me to see the interest and the innovation regarding apps and big data and all those things. That's not in my wheelhouse. And so I really like the fact that we're playing in a sandbox that there's really not a lot of competition, but a lot of opportunity, a lot of strategics.
So you just submitted your 510K.
We did.
If you had to do it again, would you do it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have a great team. We've been developing the team over the past few years. We know that it's a huge clinical problem that has not been solved yet. Our key opinion leaders, the patients that we go see, there's a huge need for a better catheter that doesn't occlude. And it isn't we've talked about this as well. It's not the sexiest thing in the world, right? It's a catheter, yeah, all right, it's been around for 30 years. I get that a lot. But then I think, the more savvy investors or the people that are interested in solving real world clinical problems, they start kind of digging in and say, wow, catheters, especially in the PICC space, they have a 25% occlusion rate, right? And now that the changes to reimbursement are slowly being implemented, those are real costs associated with patients coming into the hospital. And it's a problem that is rising in terms of the clinical evidence and the awareness. And so I think those things are helping us out.
So as you've learned more about the space, are there any interesting technology advancements that you see as potential up and coming, or any advancements in materials you've seen recently that you think might be interesting?
Like I said, I think there's a huge lack. I think there's a ton of areas within medicine that could benefit, not from new materials that are designed from scratch, but I think, as we discussed as well, leveraging other developments. Right? There's been a ton of research on new materials, but just a huge gap between the development at a university and then implementing those into devices. It's not just enough to create a material. You know, we could have easily tried to be a material company, but that's not where the value is. And a lot of the strategics aren't investing in, you know, a pure technology play. And so you have to take it to that next level. And you also get a lot more value for that. It's more difficult and more challenging and riskier, but, you know, that's really where the value is.
Interesting. Before we switch gears, any questions from the audience? I'm sure everybody's. Okay. So I did want to talk a little bit about, so when we had our call, we talked a little bit about the things that you've kind of seen in your experience in the medical industry. And you said something about things going from eyeball tests to digital biomarkers and kind of that journey. I'd be interested to get, you know, kind of your perspective on that, and as well as the panelists, kind of where things are going. Are there any trends we should be keeping an eye on?
Well, there's two things that are really important that are related but separate and distinct. One is disease management, and the other is clinical trials. So at the end of the day, drugs and devices or combinations thereof end up having to go through a regulatory process, and that almost invariably requires clinical trials. So that's kind of one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is that most disease, particularly now with an aging population, most disease is chronic disease. So disease management is not something that takes place at a moment in time, you know, like a gunshot wound, not that those don't happen. But most management takes place over time, and there are two questions. One is, how is the disease progressing? And the other is, how is the therapy working? So how do you answer these two questions? Well, I have some really bad news. In the year 2017, the instrument that's used for one of the most prevalent neurodegenerative diseases, Parkinson's disease, is a 3-page questionnaire called the UPDRS, 2 pages of which are filled out by the patient, and 1 page is filled out by the physician. The same thing is true of Huntington's disease. Same thing is true of multiple sclerosis. Same thing is true many, many, many diseases. And again, speaking as a physician, there is no physician whose clinical acumen is such that they can have digital precision. So let me give you a couple of examples about why this might be very useful for drug and device development and why it may be useful in patient management and assessment. We work with a prominent academic physician at the University of Rochester who uses our sensors and found that the tremor of a patient with Parkinson's disease has a particular native frequency, happens to be at about 5 hertz. There are also harmonics off of that frequency that are visible if you have the right kind of data and you can display them in an appropriate manner. But the punchline is, number one, no doctor on planet Earth is going to look at your hand and say, oh yeah, that's about 5 hertz. But more importantly, we can actually see those harmonics disappear and the power spectrum alter when the patient is on medication. Last year alone, about $600 million in phase 3 trials went under as failed phase 3 trials because the so-called results of the phase 2 could not be validated in phase 3. These were all in neurodegenerative conditions, and they were all based on these kinds of subjective measurements wherein a physician literally looked at you and said, I think your disability is a 2, and the other physician said, I think it's a 3. Well, ironically, there's no 2.5 in the non-digital world. So the reason for new digital biomarkers is to create precision where there was none, repeatability where there was none, to make something objective where it was previously subjective, and to be able to bring those 3 things to bear on both patient management and drug efficacy, and on the way in which we test and clear drugs and devices to market.
Any thoughts from you guys on that?
And I think Art hit it in terms of going from these paper forms that are totally subjective to getting data. And, we presented.
This is really true in pain.
Yeah, pain. All pain is it's a 10-point scale. Things like fibromyalgia also use a multi-page questionnaire to diagnose fibromyalgia. We've seen, and the literature supports a significant linkage between sleep quality and pain. And we presented papers at the American Sleep Foundation, actually the last 2 meetings, where we're looking at different cohorts of sleepers based on the data we get from our device and how we can see pain, the linkage between pain and sleep. So at the end of the day, when we talk to, again, a chronic pain sufferer, if we're helping you sleep better, if we're helping you get more active, if we're helping your mood, that's really what it's all about. And we can get data as we're delivering therapy. We've got about 2.5 million hours of data so far based on Quell users, and that grows every day. And we find more and more as we're able to peel back that onion.
So one of the things I did want to ask about are trends. Anything that you guys see as really, this is the thing to keep an eye on, what's not going away, and what might be a little bit of hype? You can say it's okay.
Well, I think that to me there's 3 big trends: consumerization of healthcare, personalization, as well as big data. If you look at the direction healthcare is going in our country, and regardless of what political bent you look at, people aren't being served. There's a growth of chronic disease that, from a societal standpoint, we're challenged to effectively manage. People end up needing to take more responsibility for their health care, particularly any underserved disease. And I'll take fibromyalgia as an example. Up until a few years ago, people just thought it was all in the fibromyalgia patient's head. Therefore, there are massive user groups online where people are sharing, this works, that doesn't work. And for any chronic disease, you'll see these user groups. And people are very active. In many cases, they know more than their GP. So I don't see that trend changing, and I think access to data will only continue. Over 72% of patients research before they go to see their doctor, and with millennials, it's over 90%. So that's not changing. In terms of personalization, whether it's the fact you can decode your genome for $150, or what we're doing right now with using digital technology, where we can use an algorithm and an app to help determine the right dosage, I think that will continue, and we'll see more personalization. And then data, I think Art really covered that in terms of data is really helping change the way care is delivered and putting precision where precision just wasn't possible.
So I don't honestly know if this is a trend. I suspect it is, and I'm hoping it is, and we're betting on it. But that said, right now it's only sort of anecdotal. In December 2015, New England Journal of Medicine, there was an article called isosorbide mononitrate in patients with congestive heart failure and preserved left ventricular function. Now, when you read a title like that, and it's a multi-center trial of all the usual suspects in ivory towers, you kind of expect that when you slip down to the conclusions, you'll see something about ejection fraction, max VO2, some kind of hardcore cath lab-oriented outcome. The primary endpoint of this trial was total actigraphy units. The question is, do patients who take this medicine do better? What does do better mean? In this view, it was, do they move around more? I was flabbergasted and also encouraged. You've probably all seen the drug Entresto, which they're pushing like hotcakes on TV. Entresto is right now in the middle of a huge trial. Every single one of their endpoints is a quality of life endpoint. Nobody's asking the question about renal function. Nobody's asking the question about various hormones, cytokines, blah, blah, blah. Nobody's asking about your ejection fraction. All it's about is quality of life. So the punchline of this story is, how do you measure quality of life, particularly with some, at least objective physiological roots? And the answer is you have to do it with wearables, and you have to do it in the home. There's no assessing the quality of life with an intermittent blood pressure cuff every 3 months. It's just, so this maybe is a trend. I think it is. I think that clinical trials in particular and drug efficacy very specifically are starting to look now at quality of life metrics and the physiology underlying quality of life and seeing them as legitimate targets for therapy and criteria for the success or failure of a drug or a device.
Jim, any thoughts?
I'll take the bait. I'm a contrarian by my nature, and I think anytime you see large amounts of money going into specific segments, mobile health, big data, blockchain, Bitcoin, you name it, I think it's overhyped. I think ultimately there are areas and there are going to be people that are wildly successful in those spaces when you develop the right information, the right clinical evidence. But there's definitely some hype in there. Personally, I think. Now you could turn around and say, well, you're doing a material, wasn't that, the hype 20 years ago? It certainly was. I think things are changing, again, from the perspective of strategics. Ultimately, we would need to work with a large strategic to get our technology to the masses. I think, competing against large conglomerates that dominate the space is probably not the smartest move, but being able to develop a technology that addresses clinical needs. And I think that's what it comes down to. If you're truly addressing a need, a market-driven need, you're going to be successful. If you can avoid the hype and certainly maybe ride the wave of VCs in terms of their mentality about needing to be in a specific space, if you could, I think you're going to be successful. But for me, I see the opportunity where I want to play where people aren't playing in a different sandbox, right? We don't, not a lot of people, reinventing venous access, but I think that's where I see the opportunity is be in a space that someone else isn't in.
I think just one point to build on that is I think your point of find a problem and solve it is one of the challenges a lot of the hype misses, particularly in digital health. There's a lot of apps out there that frankly are cool, but don't really solve any real problems. At the end of the day, find a big problem to solve.
Yeah.
I should probably get rid of half the apps on my phone then, right? It's
Yeah,
not working
yeah.
out. Yeah.
At least.
Yeah, noted. Well, we have a little less than 10 minutes, and I'd love to open up for any other questions that you all have, if anyone has.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on Jim's last answer. And I won't shout at you. Yeah, I'll just piggyback on Jim's last answer. And, from my perspective, I think that, number one, solving problems is really what always has to drive industry. But one thing that I certainly see is a trend toward hybridization across the industry. And that can mean a host of different things, but certainly taking bits and pieces from things that we know to work and applying them in ways that solve problems. So innovation tends to be very much recombinant. And I would love to hear each of your three perspectives specifically on that statement. And there's a lot of different perspective and experience represented up there, whether it's materials or the side of medical practice. And I will award extra credits if you don't use the word data more than once in answering this question.
Okay. Who's up?
I think diabetes is a good example. You talked about hybridization and sort of, I assume, integrating different technologies. And if you look at some of the stuff Dexcom's doing with Google, where they're, the whole trend towards basically the artificial pancreas, that taking some different technologies, whether it was continuous blood glucose monitoring, where you look at an insulin pump, and then how do you connect them in a way that adds more value than either of them would individually. We took old technology. TENS, was developed like 40 some years ago by Medtronic as a precursor to an implantable. And the technology just really hadn't been innovated against, despite the fact that there was, potential in terms of building intelligence in, miniaturization. and really applying it differently clinically. So I think there are a lot of areas where you look at different things that are done in isolation and you can connect them and actually add a lot of value.
Sure. Great question, and something that we've benefited from, right? It's about building blocks, right, and figuring out what can you learn from people that went before you. You're never going to figure out something in isolation, especially in the med device space. And so, we've benefited from clinical trials that have already been conducted on materials and technologies that have, attempted to address the same issue, submissions that have attempted to get similar claims, experiences that everyone in the company has had before in terms of their expertise or things to watch out for. And so I think it's an integral part of being successful is avoiding the pitfalls that everyone else has fallen into, and we benefit tremendously from that on a daily basis.
So I was sensitive to the word recombinant. I like the concept. What a lot of people are alluding to, and has already been alluded to, is the notion of taking two things and combining them. And in fact, for some long time now, in many different connections, the notion of the closed loop system, whether it be as a regulatory challenge or as a technical challenge, or as a challenge that's clinical, wherein one end of the loop is well established and the other is not so reliable. We could talk all day long about the artificial pancreas in that regard. But I think I would just leave this as more of an editorial comment than an answer. Every loop in clinical medicine has invariably been closed. It was closed by a clinician. A clinician looked at the number and said, here's what we're going to do. Now, I know in the space in the intensive care unit where people were trying to decide how to control insulin to keep it normal because there were 100 good papers that said that was the right thing to do, they found out that a critical care nurse, if he or she was particularly adept, could probably do that glucose determination in about 5 minutes. That is, get out the equipment, draw the blood, do the discard, actually get the number, write the number down, chart it, blah, blah, blah. 5 minutes. Average nursing shift is 12 hours. That is 60 minutes, ladies and gentlemen, 1 entire hour out of a nursing shift to do one thing. And many clinical trials, the most notable of which was kind of a death knell for this, was stopped early because of an unacceptable incidence of hypoglycemia and even death. A clinician can simply not measure your blood sugar frequently enough for you to tolerate an insulin drip, period. So part of recombination is finding a smart system that would make the same decision a clinician would, that gets precise input and makes good determinations, but this is why God invented the computer, is to do it over and over and over again, relentlessly, tirelessly, without complaining, because we've proven time and again that there's just not enough time in the day for a clinician to make that decision for you all the time. But heretofore, and I suspect for some time to be, all loops are closed. It's just a question of how and by whom.
I think we've probably got time for one more question. If anybody has anything they'd like to ask. No? We all good? Okay. Oh, yes. Go ahead.
Maybe a little bit of crystal ball time. Do you see wearables changing over time? And the question is predicated on the notion that wearables today are mostly short to medium-term diagnostic and maybe long-term therapeutic. Is there a different paradigm that'll come out of that? Implantable wearables, wearables that stay in patients for a certain amount of time to change anatomies? What's the next step for wearables?
Here it is. What I have in my hand is the size, shape, and weight of a Band-Aid. It has an accelerometer, a gyroscope. It has electrodes that can do EMG or ECG. It has flash memory, an onboard microprocessor, Bluetooth low energy, and an inductively rechargeable battery. It has electronic circuits in it, but in spite of that, it is twistable, bendable, stretchable, conformable, and can be put on any part of the human body. This is not the end of the story. This is the next chapter in the story.
He'll buy you a drink later for queuing that up. That was awesome. Well done. Anything else from either of our panelists that you want to know?
Yeah, I just wanted to build on that. I think that, you look at the Apple Watch and that is potential as a health monitor. You look at the stuff that MC10's doing. The ability to monitor, track is getting cheaper, easier, and can be put into so many devices that I just think there won't be a one-size-fits-all.
Jim, any last thoughts or?
Yes. No, I think there'll be more innovation, and you'll see, once the groundwork is set for some of these more, acute type products, I think you'll eventually see people go into the chronic, longer term space.
Well, great. I would like to say thank you again to all of our panelists, and thank you all for attending. Don't forget, there's another session in here in 5 minutes, so hold your seats or grab some coffee and come back quickly.